John Harvey Kellogg prescribed bland cereal foods, including early flaked grains, to cool the body and reduce sexual excitement, especially masturbation. He did it as physician superintendent of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, where diet was an instrument of moral medicine rather than a neutral kitchen experiment. Kellogg treated digestion and desire as one problem. In his advisory book Plain Facts for Old and Young, and in the wider health reform literature tied to the sanitarium, he cast rich, seasoned, or stimulating food as fuel for what he and his peers called sexual self-abuse. Plain grains, careful chewing, and a deliberately dull plate were meant to quiet the nerves and keep the will in charge of the body. Patients at Battle Creek lived under that regimen. Food chosen to lower heat and excitement, not to chase flavor or modern ideas of balanced macros. Histories of late 19th century Battle Creek and American health reform still treat that linkage, diet, digestion, and sexual purity as central to Kellogg's system, not as side color. The flaked cereals that later left the clinic began inside that program. They were tools for bodily discipline first. Bland, dry, easy to standardize, and aimed at cooling appetite in the broadest sense Kellogg meant it. Whether the flakes worked as anti-arousal medicine is beside the point the record actually supports. What the record shows is design intent. The foods were engineered in a purity clinic that yoked breakfast to sexual self-control. So the origin of everyday cereal is not a wholesome lab story about nutrition. The first mass cereal logic was moral management of bodies. Will Keith Kellogg, who had worked the flaking process inside the sanitarium world, broke from his brother's medical line and turned the flakes into a sweetened packaged grocery sold under a company name. Business histories of the Kellogg Company and biographies of the brothers treat that rupture as the moment a therapeutic food left the clinic for ordinary retail shelves. Will had managed production while John Harvey ran the medical program at Battle Creek. The flakes had been tools of the purity diet, bland, dry, meant to cool appetite in the sense John prescribed. Will pushed to add sugar, allow broader seasoning, put the product in boxes, and sell it through ordinary stores rather than keep it tied to sanitarium channels. John opposed the move. He treated the food as medicine for self-control and resisted making it more stimulating or turning it into open commerce. The split followed that disagreement. Will organized manufacturing under a firm that carried the Kellogg name, packaged toasted flakes for retail, and built distribution beyond Battle Creek patients. Standard accounts of the company's founding and the brothers' biographies keep returning to the same break. Sugar, packaging, and national grocery marketing on one side. John's moral medical restrictions on the other. John stayed with the regimen. Will sold breakfast. What changed was not a sudden finding about nutrition. The same flaked grain that began as disciplined food became a shelf item with a brand mark and a morning occasion attached to a box. Households could buy it without a sanitarium prescription. Cereal left the clinic and entered the pantry as brand before it entered tradition. Battle Creek did not stay a one-family story. CW Post, shaped by the same sanitarium and health reform culture that produced the Kellogg's, launched competing cereals and sold them with sweeping cure-all health promises that outran the evidence. Post had come to Battle Creek as a patient after illness and business collapse. He lived inside the town's regimen, bland grains, coffee substitutes, digestion treated as repair for body and nerves, then carried that vocabulary out of the wards and onto grocery packaging. In the mid-1890s, he began roasting grain into postum, a dark drink sold against coffee, and soon after pressed wheat and barley into grape nuts, a hard, dry cereal meant to be chewed slowly. Company histories of the Postum Cereal Company and standard surveys of American food advertising describe the method. Full-page newspaper and magazine copy that promised tonic lift, steadier nerves, and general wellness from a box on the shelf. Period ads treated ordinary flaked or ground grain as if it were a clinic prescription. Later food history scholarship has repeatedly noted the gap. The claims were sales language borrowed from reform medicine, not results measured in a ward. Other makers followed the same path. Local and industrial histories of Battle Creek record the town filling with small cereal plants, patent filings, brand names, and printed cartons that reused sanitarium words for digestion, purity, and strength. The air of the place shifted from steam rooms and prescribed meals to roasting drums, packing lines, and outbound rail cars of labeled boxes. By the early 20th century, the grocery aisle already carried the afterlife of reform medicine as slogan and package design more than as supervised protocol. What widened was not a new science of breakfast. A Purity Spa's diet talk had become an industrial hub's advertising. Breakfast cereal's hometown was a Purity Spa turned factory district. The other half of the American breakfast plate was sold the same decade, not as farm tradition, but as a packing company campaign. In the 1920s, Edward Bernays, hired to lift bacon sales for the Beechnut Packing Company, set out to make a heavier morning meal feel medically sound. Beechnut needed households to eat more bacon. Bernays did not lead with a product slogan. He arranged for a physician to survey other doctors on whether a light breakfast, coffee and a roll, was adequate or whether a heartier meal served the body better. Favorable replies came back for the heavier option. Those replies were then circulated to newspapers, so the preference read as independent medical consensus rather than client publicity. Bacon and eggs sat ready as the concrete form of that preference. The hearty meal the press was now describing. Bernays' own retrospective accounts of his work, and major biographies of American public relations that draw on them, treat the Beechnut Hearty Breakfast physician letter campaign as a canonical case of third-party authority used to move a commodity. The mechanism was simple and documented. Borrow medical prestige. Seed the press. Let the client's product ride inside the new norm. Cereal had left Battle Creek as packaged reform language. Bacon and eggs left a public relations desk as borrowed clinical judgment. A bacon company helped write the script for what counted as a real breakfast. By the middle decades of the 20th century, those two tracks had fused into one culturally locked morning meal. A proper American breakfast meant packaged cereal in a bowl, or a heavy savory plate built around bacon and eggs, or both, and the arrangement no longer read as a sales target. It read as how the day was supposed to begin. Food history and advertising scholarship on the cereal industry document decades of campaign work that treated breakfast as a daily obligation centered on branded goods. Manufacturers kept repeating that the morning meal was essential and incomplete without their products on the table. Parallel to that effort sat the hearty template Bernays had helped publicize for Beechnut: eggs and bacon as the concrete form of a medically respectable start. Neither track needed a single miracle slogan. Layered publicity did the work: print ads, radio, packaging, and borrowed authority, teaching shoppers that a finished morning looked like a box of flakes or a loaded plate. Phrases cast as common wisdom, including long-running claims that breakfast was the most important meal of the day, functioned in practice as durable campaign language rather than neutral folk knowledge handed down outside the market. The result was habit where repetition stopped announcing itself. People who had never set foot in Battle Creek, and who had never heard Edward Bernays' name, still organized the first meal of the day around goods that began as purity medicine and client publicity. What felt like settled custom was the afterimage of products sold hard enough and long enough to disappear into ordinary life. The ordinary breakfast that still feels like common sense is largely leftover purity ideology and industrial publicity. What looks like folk custom on the table is the afterlife of Battle Creek medical moral diet logic and of publicity that made a branded morning meal feel mandatory. Histories of American health reform, of the Kellogg enterprise, of Battle Creek cereal industry, and of public relations keep the chain visible. Bland flaked grains left a purity clinic that linked digestion to sexual self-control. Commerce then sweetened and nationalized them as grocery brands. Competing makers in the same town converted sanitarium vocabulary into cure-all packaging. Edward Bernays' 1920s work for Beechnut Packing Company seeded physician preference for a hearty breakfast into the press so bacon and eggs could harden into a medically respectable plate. Food history and advertising scholarship track the long reinforcement that cast breakfast as a daily obligation incomplete without branded grain or that heavy protein start. None of this is a conspiracy over every bowl. It is cultural residue. Moral anxiety about appetite supplied the early cereal logic. Salescraft supplied the bacon and eggs lock-in and the non-negotiable meal frame. The softer story, that people simply always ate this way because folk custom and settled dietary science agreed, does not survive the documentary trail. What remains in the aisle is reform medicine and commodity publicity mistaken for timeless nutrition. Taken as a set, those origins answer the open question. People treat a sold breakfast as common sense because the selling worked. Morning still arrives with a box and a plate. The campaigns that fix them there no longer need to say their names.